Thank you. I'm still trying to work out what a black swan disguised as a black elephant is. So if anyone would like to do the cartoon between now and tomorrow morning, and if you want to have some kind of third jellyfish as well involved with the black elephant and the swan, then please do. But I still think we're facing something of a red alert here. As we just heard, people do not really care anymore. But these are profound issues that we're raising, and Peter Ho has put it right on the agenda about how government and governance is going to handle this with all these unthinkables. And Victor was saying we need to be proactive. Governments need to be proactive. Lynn Wells as well was saying the same thing. There's a message coming out here, expecting people to handle, how to handle their lives in different ways. These are potentially existential issues here. And Liran as well saying, leaving behind those who do not have an intention or an ability to understand the enormity, an intuition I should say, I can't read my shorthand here, an intuition to understand the enormity of what's happening. So I would put to you, there are very, very serious issues about governance. It's all very well saying governments will eventually catch up, like with Deliveroo and Uber. But the public is making up its mind incredibly quickly. And Max used a phrase which probably is going a bit too far, but he talked about scared, angry, hungry people. We're not at that stage yet, but this kind of reaction to things that people don't like or don't feel comfortable with in a life where they're hyper-connected, wherever they are, including in swamps or in tribal lands or something, is really something very serious, because getting back to that eating an elephant in a mouthful, it's the speed at which this is going to happen and the speed at which government can't catch up. We've already seen the manifestations of this with Brexit. We've seen it as well with Trump. This inability of the systems to handle, and the systems of politics to handle the enormity of what's going on, the public denial, the disbelief as well. And a couple of things just to finish off with. I was here a couple of months ago for the sea trade, the shipping industries, big annual conference. And one of the things they are perplexed and indeed threatened by is 3D printing. Containers will not have to run from Indonesia to Germany. Instead, in Germany, they're making their own shoes now based on the kind of things that Lynn put on the agenda. This is happening amazingly quickly. And government and governance and leadership, as Peter said right at the beginning, is thinking about what's happening in the election cycle, as opposed to the enormity of what's going to happen. But I'd put to you, as we've seen with Brexit, with Trump, and in the British election, the public takes a view very quickly, is very connected, and if it doesn't like what it sees, it turns against those in power and in corporate power as well. And that's why it's a very serious existential challenge, which can't simply be put on the back burner for another day, some way down the track. Ken.
Thank you. Wow, follow that. Believe it or not, I am actually an optimist, which is illustrated by the football team I support, but never mind. Nick's quite right when he says that the factors that are influencing society today are very profound. And if you live in a little bubble and you're kind of protected and you've got a nice life, you try not to think about those things, because that's a threat you don't want to think about. So what I've done, I've made some proper notes here, which is unusual for me. And it's really an attempt to inform the landscape, the conversations that we've heard throughout the day. So I've pulled different points from each speaker. So if you bear with me, and I'll try and give some twist on that as well. So we started with Peter, and the main thing I took from his speech was that reductionism means you lose sight of the system, and you shouldn't get drawn into that. From personal experience, I know that's absolutely true. Part of my history was involved with designing and then building and operating some incredibly sophisticated global supply chains, along with teams of people that were much cleverer than me that made it happen. And whenever you tried to focus on a particular part that was having a problem, that was always the wrong thing to do. You had to look at the whole system to understand the impact of that particular problem, and therefore how to resolve it, which may not, in many cases, didn't mean dealing with the problem there, it meant doing something else somewhere else in the system. So that's actually true, but many people can't grasp a holistic view of a problem, so they tend to try and, break it down. Kisher was very interesting as far as I was concerned, because he made the observation that the West is an aberration in history and that the norms are going to be restored very soon. But unfortunately, politics is also in hock to an ill-informed electorate, which is very true, and social media kind of amplifies that. The West has been the custodian of the global order and finds it impossible to accept that its position is declining. But then, interestingly, the Donald made part of his election message, "Make America great again." So, if we have a problem accepting that the West is in decline, why does he need to make it great again? Just an observation. Cell phones are everywhere, and the interesting thing about a cell phone is not so much the power and capability of a cell phone, it's what it means to the cell phone supply chain, in that it has reduced the cost of sensors, because now millions and millions and millions of sensors are being made to go into cell phones. Those same sensors are going to be used to inform the so-called Internet of Things. There's a little bit of a problem with that though, because if you have sensors everywhere and in everything, they're going to be beeping and burping and generating huge amounts of data. Most organisations are unable to cope with this flood or tsunami of data, so they're just going to ignore it. But there'll be others that will capture it. The issue is, though, the context of that data, being able to derive meaning from it. And if you can derive meaning, then that informs a lot of the other developments that we've heard mentioned. Evelyn mentioned that China is exerting great influence, and given that we're sticking close to the theme of black, I think really China should be viewed as a black hole, because it exists and everything around it is drawn into it or drawn towards it, whether they like it or not, just because of the huge influence that it provides. But I do fundamentally agree that small states are grits in the machine and opinionated and unpredictable. I cite the United Kingdom through its history as an example of this. Just one observation about the comments that Chris was making. In terms of Alibaba, Alibaba copied an organisation called Global Sources. I was slightly involved in this back in the mid to late 1990s in Hong Kong. And Global Sources was actually set up by a US guy and was pretty successful in linking manufacturers across China with customers in the US. And Jack Ma, the guy behind Alibaba, looked at that and said, this is an interesting idea. I wonder if we can do stuff with this on the interweb. And the rest, as they say, was history. But interestingly, Global Sources met him, saw what was going on, and viewed him with complete derision, because they just couldn't imagine that this ex-school teacher could actually challenge and compete with them. So that's an interesting lesson as far as I was concerned. The issue of technology optimism is brilliant, and being able to introduce technology to societies such as in Saudi and empower females, which is half the population, is fantastic. But in many of these instances, you see that legislation, habit, culture are often impediments to really taking advantage of the potential. And the same goes for intellectual property challenges as well. But that shouldn't be an excuse not to try and take advantage of these. The One Belt, One Road initiative that Parag highlighted, I've got some familiarity with this because for years my industry, logistics, looked at using the Trans-Siberian Railway as a fast way of getting products from Asia into Europe. But people will only use these things if they are reliable and predictable. So no matter how much a state might trumpet or invest or say this is going to be fantastic and change your lives, unless they match norms that business expect to operate profitably, they're unlikely to succeed. So he also went on to say that city-states and various entities and countries are trying to understand what's going on. But again, in many of the presentations that we've had today, in my view, they all assume that the world is structured very similarly to the way it is today, and I'm not sure that's true going forward. So maybe we need to think about that. In terms of the panel discussion that followed that, the challenge of education was brought up, that there's a young population that are being empowered, but unfortunately much of the narrative to them is being dumbed down just so that they take it on board. Whereas in the developed world, you've got such a hunger for knowledge. The people there are trying to understand what's going on, and you know, young people aren't generally dumb. If you give them information in the right way, they will be able to take advantage of it. And humanity's missing a trick if we don't exploit that. And unfortunately, social media, for all its goods, for all the good it does, is an echo chamber for a lot of the bad, which is unfortunate. May-Ann, the storyteller. New models of technology incompatible with established conventions. I think that's very true, that technology challenges so many conventional ways of operating, working, and so on, that we struggle to kind of grasp the advantages that they can provide. And just on a slightly curious note, when you've got robots everywhere, what does a tax policy for robots look like? And how do they file their tax returns? In terms of Lyon, the InfoSec policies in large organisations, this is something that I've seen time and time again. You've got a global multinational or a very large organisation. They have very strict information security policies, which is great. But unfortunately, those policies usually prevent those organisations in adapting fast enough to commercial and competitive challenges. And so there needs to be a balance between trusting people, keeping information in the organisation appropriately secure, but at the same time allowing a certain amount of agility and adaptability. And in terms of black swans or black elephants, again, these are part of the normal processes in day-to-day life which ignore things that can result in either black swans or the elephant in the room, such as we've got great information security, but it's so secure no one can actually do anything. So when there's a problem coming along, how can we react? We know there's a problem, but we can't because the policies stop us from doing that. And in terms of an illustration of that, the video earlier on in the day about the cyber attack that crippled the NHS in the UK, it wasn't that the core systems were open to disruption. They weren't. It was the fact that the attackers were able to go after peripherals and systems that handled those peripherals that were written years ago, very insecure, but the systems that they were supporting could not be updated, but they did vital day-to-day work. So the NHS just let them persist. But because they were interconnected to the core systems, the viruses kind of bounced through. And just as a security measure, back to the InfoSec policies, the high command in the NHS said just shut everything down until we know we're going to be okay. So a lot of the systems that were shut down were unlikely to be attacked by the virus because they'd already been patched. But people didn't realise this and said we can't afford to take the risk, so we'll shut them down. So it became a self-fulfilling prophecy after a while. And again, all of these things need to be seen in the context of how organisations work and organisational behaviour. It's culture, context, all of that. In terms of Lynn's presentation, I have to declare a cognitive bias here because I know him and he's a very smart guy, but I think this was the best presentation of the day. And in terms of biomechanics and bioengineering, I hope he does live to his 140, but whether he will or not, whether he chooses to. Managing change must be the norm, but technology can make that change happen faster, which may not necessarily be a good thing. So managing change is very important, and an organisation needs to be inculcated with that. But understanding what's good change and what's bad change is much harder, and technology just accelerates that, whether it's good and bad. The most interesting thing, and I think the most powerful idea of the day, was augmenting human interaction with governments. And again, from Lynn's presentation, using a program to help people interact with government services is a fantastic idea and means more to people's lives than being able to turn around and say, I've got the latest iPhone or the latest tablet or whatever. And I think that's very, very profound. Finally, just some observations on Victor's presentation was, in terms of artificial intelligence, are we developing it in our own image, just so that we can understand what it is we're trying to do? I'm not sure whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, but trying to mimic the way we are and using artificial intelligence as a surrogate for that, I'm not sure. But I think it will actually be insidious if you see the way Apple are designing Siri as opposed to Amazon and Google's efforts. Siri is very much behind the scenes, offering you services and things that you didn't realise that they were there until all of a sudden they pop up on your device. And it's very helpful and very useful. You can just take advantage. Oh, I didn't realise that. That's great. Take advantage of it. But what they're actually doing is starting to train Siri to do this kind of stuff. And that's fine. It's great. That's cute. But do you want Apple to be the person who decides whether that's good or bad for you? So that's essentially my take on the presentations today. Generally, I would say that it's been fascinating, interesting presentations from some very interesting and worthy speakers. But have we really got close to being able to identify what the signs are for black swans or black elephants? I'm not so sure. But there again, I'm not an academic. So. Thank you.